In 1954, almost 10 years after the Second World War, a man named Robert Lowndes had returned to his home in Virginia. Robert, although being a hero, was abandoned and shunned throughout his community. Robert didn't look like most people. He was scarred and severely burned up and down his face. Robert was a flamethrower operator in the war. He was given the lifespan of 5 minutes when lugging around the 2 tanks of gasoline on his back, but Robert, being the trooper he was, fought his way through Nazi-occupied Germany and survived. When he returned to the States, he found himself beaten, battered, tired, and homeless. He couldn't find a job because he lacked qualifications, and he couldn't work in the front because of his deformities. So Robert headed to the forest and hills of Virginia to hide away. One day, in 1955, as Robert sat in front of the shack he had made, 2 hikers from the city were passing through. Robert didn't pay attention to them until he noticed they were hiding behind a log and observing him. They figured he couldn't see him, but he continued on with his time. Then one of the city men found it upon themselves to shout, "Hey, ugly!" Robert turned to look and saw the 2 of them laughing. Robert stood at a staggering 6.5 feet and walked towards the men. One shouted, "Shit, the freak's approaching us," then started pacing down the hill that Robert's shack was built on, but Robert ran as fast as he could. He grabbed one of the men by the arm and threw him to the ground. The man shouted, "Let me go, you monster!" Robert was angered as he was being mocked. He saw red. He grabbed the nearest rock and began smashing in the head of the man. 11 hits with a rock and the hiker's skull was smashed. He was dead. Robert dropped the rock and looked down to see what he had done. He was shocked, but realized death was nothing new. He then looked over to see the other hiker running away in the distance. No hiker was as fast as Robert, seeing as he had to run from gunfire and explosions for several years. Robert quickly caught up with a man, grabbed him by his long blonde hair and tossed him down the hill. Robert slowly walked down the hill and then came upon the man who was lying on the ground in the fetal position. Robert knew this man was up to something. He wasn't injured enough to just give up like that, so Robert prepared himself. As he approached the man, the hiker jumped with a hunting knife in his hand and shouted, "Die, monster!" But Robert grabbed him by the arm, twisted it until he dropped the knife and threw him to the ground. Robert then picked up the knife and tossed it at a tree. Robert then punched the hiker until he was out and dragged him and the other body to the shack. The hiker woke up in a daze to see he was hanging from a ceiling by the muscles in his arms, being pierced by hooks. When he saw his arms, he shrieked in pain and agony. He looked around to see that he appeared to be in a makeshift basement, supported by wooden support beams and lit by a single candle. He then began screaming louder for help, and then started to hear footsteps walk down the makeshift stairs leading to the shack. Robert slowly walked down the stairs eating a chunk of squirrel meat. The hiker looked at him breathing heavily and covered in sweat. Robert put his hands around the hiker's waist and turned him so he could see behind him. As he turned completely, he could see parts of his friend's body hacked and mutilated placed across an old workbench. This made the hiker scream and yell. Then a gag was wrapped around his mouth from behind. "Shut up," Robert said calmly in his deep voice. The man could see all the detail in Robert's face, how severe the burns were, how crooked and bent his nose was, how greasy and unwashed his long brown hair was. The man just cried behind the gag. Robert began shaking the man to shut up, and the man's satchel came loose and fell to the ground. Robert opened it up to see inside. He emptied the whole thing onto the dirt floor of the basement. A tube of chapstick, some nuts, and pictures fell out along with a camera. Robert observed the picture to see naked women with gags in their mouths, covered in tears and brutally beaten. "What is this? What is this?" shouted Robert. He just heard the man cry behind the gag. He pulled off the gag and asked again what it was. The man stuttered and said, They're my victims." "Victims of what?" yelled Robert. The man was too scared to answer. "You sick fuck," Robert said in his deep voice. He then grabbed a dull box cutter and began slicing it at the hiker's ankles as he hung. How does it feel to be helpless like your victims? He said. The man just cried behind the gag. Robert then walked back up the stairs and the man just held his head in shame, dripping blood from his ankles and arms. He then blacked out. He then woke up to Robert shouting, "Wake up!" and splashing boiling water all over the man's crotch. The man shrieked and cried as loud as he could behind the gag. Robert then stuck a needle into the man's open wound and he cried even more as it burned like hell. "This will keep you awake for every second," Robert whispered into the man's ear. He then got the box cutter and began slicing the man's nipples off. All the man could do is cry helplessly. As his nipples fell to the ground, Robert grabbed a ball attached to a chain. He began spinning it in the air, then threw it directly at the man's testicles. The man yelled as loud as he could under the gag, hoping it would end, but it had just begun. Robert then lowered the man to the chains and he fell directly to the ground. Robert dragged him by his hair to the other side of the room, where a bathtub was placed. Inside the bathtub was a clear foamy substance. "You see that?" Robert said quietly. The man moaned, "Yes. It's acid, and you're going to burn for the pain you've caused me and others." The man began crying harder than he did before. Robert just lifted him up and dropped him in. The man just splashed around in it, crying and screaming. Robert walked back up the stairs to get more meat. When he returned, the man was dead. The acid burned most of his body to the bone, and he had to stay awake, though it all until it reached his heart and burned it away. Robert walked back upstairs to continue his day.